So, here's something to think about as you settle in tonight. Right now, as you're lying there, probably somewhere warm, probably with the lights dimmed or off entirely, there is a machine running underneath everything around you. Not a machine you can see, not something with gears or a motor humming in the corner. It's something much bigger than that, much stranger. It stretches across the entire country you live in, across borders, across mountain ranges, sometimes even across oceans. And it is working right now, this very second, to keep your world from going dark. That machine is the power grid. And the thing about the power grid is that most people never think about it at all. You flip a switch. The light comes on. You plug in your phone. It charges. The refrigerator hums in the kitchen. The air conditioning breathes through the vents. And none of it, not a single bit of it, requires a single conscious thought from you, because the whole system is designed to be invisible, to disappear into the background of your life, like gravity or the air you breathe. It's probably the most important machine in human civilization, and it operates in almost perfect silence. You trust it the way you trust the floor beneath your feet, automatically, without question. But here's the thing about invisible systems. When they work, nobody notices. When they fail, everyone notices all at once. And power grids fail more often than you might think. They fail in ways that are fascinating and terrifying and deeply strange. They fail because of trees. They fail because of squirrels. Seriously, squirrels are one of the leading causes of small-scale power outages in the United States. They chew through insulation. They bridge connections they shouldn't bridge. And they have caused hundreds of documented outages over the years. There's actually an informal tracker called Cyber One, which logs confirmed cases of animals causing power outages around the world. Squirrels, birds, snakes, raccoons, even jellyfish clogging the cooling intakes at a nuclear power plant in Sweden. It makes for darkly entertaining reading. But the grid also fails for reasons far more serious than wildlife. It fails because someone made a decision in 1965 about a relay setting, and nobody ever went back to check whether that setting still made sense 4 decades later. It fails because the sun, 93 million miles away, had a bad day and flung a cloud of charged particles at the Earth at 1,000,000 miles per hour. It fails because a software alarm system crashed silently in a control room, and nobody noticed for over an hour. And by the time anyone realized the alarms were dead, 3 major transmission lines had already gone down. It fails because of ice, because of wind, because of heat waves that buckle railroad tracks and make power lines sag into trees. And when a power grid fails, really fails, not just a flicker that resets your microwave clock, but a full blackout, something happens that most of us in the modern world have genuinely forgotten how to deal with. The modern world just stops. Not slowly, not gracefully. It stops like a heart that suddenly forgets how to beat. Traffic lights go dark at every intersection, simultaneously turning orderly streets into chaos. Elevators freeze between floors, with people trapped inside. Hospitals switch to backup generators that were only ever designed to last a few hours, not a few days. Water treatment plants lose pressure, and suddenly, the water coming from your tap can't be trusted. Cell towers burn through their backup batteries, and your phone, that device you depend on for everything, becomes a useless rectangle of glass. Gas stations can't pump fuel because the pumps run on electricity. ATMs go blank. Cash registers don't open. Sewage systems lose the pumps that keep waste flowing in the right direction. And if the outage lasts long enough, the consequences of that particular failure become deeply unpleasant. Food spoils in every refrigerator and freezer across the affected area. If it's summer, the heat becomes dangerous within hours for the elderly and the sick. If it's winter, the cold can become lethal even faster. And suddenly, in the span of a few seconds, you realize just how much of your life depends on a system you've never seen, never thought about, and couldn't explain if someone asked you to. Everything, genuinely, everything, every part of your daily routine, from the alarm that wakes you up to the streetlight that guides you home at night, is downstream of the power grid. We don't just use electricity, we are utterly, completely, almost embarrassingly dependent on it. That's what we're going to wander through tonight. The strange, complicated, sometimes heartbreaking story of how we built this invisible machine, why it breaks the way it does, and what happens to the world when it goes silent. We'll go all the way back to the beginning, to the feuds and the accidents and the engineering miracles that shaped the grid. And then we'll follow the wires forward to the blackouts, the cascading failures, the near misses, and the moments where everything almost fell apart, and sometimes did. Settle in. This one goes deep. Let's start with something that seems obvious, but actually isn't. What is the power grid? What is this machine that we've built our entire civilization on top of? Because most people, if you ask them, would say something like, it's the wires that carry electricity from the power plant to my house. And that's not wrong exactly, but it's a bit like saying the internet is the cable that connects your computer to the wall. Technically accurate, wildly incomplete. The power grid is actually 3 distinct systems working together, layered on top of each other, like a cake that nobody ever planned as a cake. Each layer was built in different decades, company by different companies, under different regulations, for different reasons. And somehow, improbably, they work together. The first layer is generation. This is where electricity is actually made. Power plants, whether they burn coal, split uranium atoms, harvest the kinetic energy of wind, or capture sunlight with photovoltaic panels, are all doing fundamentally the same thing at the most basic level. They're converting some other form of energy into electrical energy. And in most conventional power plants, the way they do this is remarkably, almost disappointingly simple in concept. They spin a magnet inside a coil of wire. That's it. That's the principle behind nearly every large-scale power plant on Earth. A turbine spins, driven by steam, or water, or wind. The turbine is connected to a generator, which is essentially a magnet rotating inside a coil. That rotating magnetic field pushes electrons through the wire, and electricity flows. Michael Faraday figured this basic principle out in 1831 using a simple experiment with a copper disc, and a horseshoe magnet. We've spent nearly 2 centuries refining the engineering, building bigger turbines and more efficient generators. But the core idea, a spinning magnet makes electricity, hasn't changed at all. The second layer is transmission. Once electricity is generated, it needs to travel, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of miles, from the place where it's made to the places where it's needed. Cities don't always sit next to rivers or coal mines or wind farms. The generation and the demand are often very far apart. And this is where things get interesting, because electricity doesn't travel for free. Every mile of wire costs energy. The current flowing through a conductor encounters resistance, and that resistance converts some of the electrical energy into heat. You're literally warming the wires, dumping energy into the atmosphere with every mile the electricity travels. So, transmission lines use extremely high voltages to minimize those losses. We're talking about 115,000 volts, 345,000 volts, sometimes 765,000 volts, or even higher. To put that in perspective, the outlet in your wall delivers 120 volts in the United States. The wires on those tall metal lattice towers you see striding across the countryside are carrying electricity at thousands of times that level. The reason for the extreme voltage is purely practical and rooted in physics. Power equals voltage times current. So, for any given amount of power you want to transmit, you can use high voltage with low current, or low voltage with high current, and the energy lost to heat in the wires depends on the square of the current. Double the current, quadruple the losses. So, by cranking the voltage way up and keeping the current low, you can push enormous amounts of power across huge distances with acceptable losses. It's one of the most important engineering decisions in the entire system, and it was enabled by a device we'll talk about in a moment. Those big metal lattice towers, the ones that look like giant steel stick figures marching single file across the landscape, aren't just holding wires up. They're holding wires apart. Because at those extreme voltages, electricity will jump through the air if conductors get too close together. That's called an arc flash, and it is one of the most violent phenomena in power engineering. The temperature at the point of an arc can exceed 35,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's roughly 4 times hotter than the surface of the sun. Workers who experience arc flash incidents, the ones who survive, describe it as being hit by a wall of superheated plasma that vaporizes metal, ignites clothing from several feet away, and creates a pressure wave that can throw a person across a room. So, those towers, those mundane, ugly structures that nobody gives a second glance, are carefully engineered to maintain safe distances between conductors, carrying enough voltage to arc through 6 feet of open air. They do this job reliably in wind, in rain, in ice storms that coat the wires with inches of frozen weight, in extreme heat that makes the metal expand and the wires sag dangerously close to the ground and the trees below. When you think about it that way, they're actually rather elegant in a purely functional, unromantic, in standing out in all weather sort of way. The third layer is distribution. This is the part of the grid you actually see and interact with. The lower voltage lines on wooden poles or buried underground that bring electricity the final leg of its journey from a local substation to your home or business. The voltage is stepped down at substations using transformers, those gray cylindrical canisters you sometimes see mounted on utility poles or humming inside fenced enclosures on the ground. Each one is doing the same simple job, taking electricity at 1 voltage and 1 voltage, converting it to a different voltage using the principle of electromagnetic induction. By the time the electricity reaches your wall outlet, it's been transformed multiple times, stepping down from hundreds of thousands of volts at the transmission level to the 120 or 240 volts that your appliances are designed to use. The transformer is one of those inventions that doesn't get nearly enough credit for shaping the modern world. It has no moving parts. It's based on principles that Faraday would have recognized immediately. You wind a coil of wire around an iron core. You wind a second coil around the same core. You run alternating current through the first coil, and a different voltage appears across the second coil. The ratio of turns in the 2 coils determines the ratio of the voltages. More turns on the output side means higher voltage. Fewer turns means lower. It's simple, it's brilliant, it's nearly 100% efficient, and it is absolutely essential to everything about the modern power grid. Without the transformer, long-distance electricity transmission would be impractical. Without long-distance transmission, every neighborhood would need its own power plant. Without centralized generation, the economics of electricity would be completely different. And the modern world, as you know, it simply wouldn't exist. And all 3 of these layers, generation, transmission, and distribution, have to work together continuously, without interruption, around the clock, every day of the year, because electricity has a fundamental property, that makes the entire system different from almost any other network or supply chain that humans have ever constructed. You cannot store it, not in any practical way, not at the scale we're talking about. When a power plant generates a megawatt of electricity, that megawatt has to be consumed somewhere, by someone, right now, in that same instant. If more electricity is produced than consumed, the excess energy has to go somewhere, and what it does is speed up the generators. The turbines spin faster. The frequency of the alternating current rises above its target. If more is consumed than produced, the generators slow down under the additional load. The frequency drops. And if it drops far enough, protective systems start disconnecting portions of the grid to prevent the generators from being damaged. The system has to be in balance constantly, like a tightrope walker who can never stop moving and can never sit down and can never sit down. Step off the wire. Think about how extraordinary that is for a moment. Every other commodity in the history of human civilization can be warehoused. You can store grain in a silo and come back for it years later. You can keep crude oil in a tank for months. You can stack lumber in a yard. You can freeze meat. You can bottle water. Even information, perhaps the most abstract commodity of all, can be stored on paper, on hard drives, in the cloud, retrieved whenever you need it. But electricity, the one resource that makes virtually everything in modern life possible, the resource that separates the developed world from the developing world belt more starkly than almost any other measure you could choose, has to be manufactured and consumed in the same heartbeat. There is no warehouse. There is no significant buffer. There is only the wire, and the wire has to carry exactly the right amount, right now, every single second of every single day. This is the fundamental engineering constraint that makes the power grid simultaneously a miracle of human coordination and a system perpetually balanced on the edge of catastrophe. And to understand how we ended up with this particular miracle, this particular slow motion disaster in waiting, you have to go back to the very beginning. And the beginning, it turns out, is louder, pettier, and more dramatic than you might expect. The story of the power grid starts with a feud, one of the nastiest, most public, and most consequential feuds in the history of technology. On one side, Thomas Edison, brilliant inventor, tireless self-promoter, holder of over 1,000 patents, and a man absolutely certain that he was right about everything important. On the other side, George Westinghouse, a successful industrialist and inventor in his own right, backed by a brilliant, eccentric, chronically underfunded Serbian-American engineer named Nikola Tesla. And the thing they were fighting about, the thing that would determine the shape of civilization for the next century and counting, was a question that sounds almost absurdly simple. Should electricity be delivered to the public as direct current or alternating current? To understand why this matters so deeply, and it matters more than almost any other technical decision ever made, you need to know the difference between these two types of current. And it's worth spending a moment on this, because it's one of those ideas that sounds dry and technical, but is actually quite intuitive once you see it clearly. Direct current, which Edison championed and built his empire around, is electricity flowing in one direction. Steady, constant, unwavering, like water flowing through a garden hose. The electrons move from the negative terminal to the positive terminal, always the same way, always at the same rate. The battery in your phone produces direct current. A flashlight runs on direct current. It's simple, it's predictable, it's easy to understand. And in the 1880s, it was the only type of electrical power that Edison was willing to put his name and his reputation behind. Alternating current, which Tesla had spent years thinking about, and which Westinghouse had the resources to commercialize, is fundamentally different. In alternating current, the electrons don't flow in one direction. They oscillate, pushing forward and then pulling back, like a wave, like a pendulum, switching direction dozens of times per second. And the reason this distinction turned out to be so consequential, the reason alternating current eventually and decisively won, is one specific capability that direct current, at least with the technology available in the 1880s, simply could not match. You can easily and efficiently change the voltage of alternating current using a device called a transformer. And here's why that single capability changed the world. When electricity travels through a wire, some of the energy is lost to heat. This is inescapable. It's just the physics of resistance in a conductor. But the amount of energy you lose depends not on the voltage, but on the current, the actual flow of electrons through the wire. And critically, the losses increase with the square of the current. Double the current, and you don't double the losses. You quadruple them. So, if you want to transmit a lot of power over a long distance without losing most of it to heat, you need to keep the current as low as possible. And since power equals voltage times current, the way to keep the current low while still transmitting a lot of power is to push the voltage a lot of very high, to push very high. Alternating current made this practical. A transformer at the power plant steps the voltage up to hundreds of thousands of volts for long-distance transmission. The current drops proportionally, and the losses along the way become manageable. At the other end, another transformer steps the voltage back down to a level safe for homes and factories. The whole process is elegant, efficient, and requires nothing more than copper wire wound around iron. No moving parts. Almost no maintenance. Direct current in Edison's day couldn't be stepped up and down this way. Not efficiently. Not with the technology that existed. Which meant Edison's system had a fundamental, crippling limitation that no amount of engineering brilliance could overcome. Every customer had to be within about a mile of a generating station, because beyond that distance, the energy losses in the wires became unacceptable. Edison's vision of the electrical future was a city dotted with dozens of small power stations, each one serving a tiny radius of customers. It worked barely for a neighborhood in lower Manhattan. But it couldn't scale. It couldn't serve a suburb, let alone a country. Edison knew this was a weakness. But instead of acknowledging the limitation and pivoting, he did something that reveals a darker side of the genius, something that tells you a lot about how powerful people respond when their empires' annals are threatened by better ideas. He launched a propaganda war against alternating current. He argued publicly that the higher voltages required for AC transmission were inherently deadly, that bringing alternating current into homes and businesses was reckless, irresponsible, tantamount to murder. And to make this argument vivid, to make it visceral, he did something genuinely disturbing. Edison funded and encouraged a series of public demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted using alternating current. Dogs, calves, horses. The demonstrations were theatrical, designed to horrify audiences and associate Westinghouse's technology with cruelty and death. In one particularly grim spectacle in 1903, an elephant named Topsy at Coney Island's Luna Park was killed using alternating current. The context is more complicated than the simple Edison versus Tesla narrative allows. Topsy had killed 3 handlers and was already condemned to die. But the method of execution and the fact that it was filmed by Edison's company served the propaganda purpose all too well. Edison also played a significant role in the development of the electric chair, which was designed to use alternating current for executions. The strategy was brutally clear. If alternating current became synonymous with the instrument of death, the public would never accept it in their homes. The first execution by electric chair was carried out on a man named William Kemmler in August 1890 at Auburn Prison in New York, and it was a disaster. The first jolt, lasting 17 seconds, didn't kill him. Kemmler was still breathing, still moving. A second jolt was applied, longer and at higher voltage. Witnesses reported smoke rising from his body, the smell of burning flesh filling the room, blood vessels rupturing beneath his skin. One attending doctor reportedly said that the execution was far worse than hanging. Reporters called it an awful spectacle, a disgrace to civilization. And Edison's camp pointed to this horror they had deliberately helped engineer, as proof that alternating current was too dangerous for public use. They even coined a verb for being killed by alternating current. They called it being Westinghoused. The pettiness of that, the willingness to associate a competitor's name with death, tells you everything about how ruthless this battle was. But here's the thing about propaganda campaigns waged against superior technology. They almost always lose in the end. You can scare people for a while, but you can't scare the physics. The mathematics was on Tesla and Westinghouse's side. Alternating current could reach further, serve more customers, and deliver electricity at a lower cost per user. The advantages weren't marginal. They were overwhelming, and in 1893, Westinghouse won the contract to power the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, one of the grandest public spectacles of the 19th century. He illuminated the White City with roughly 250,000 incandescent bulbs, all running on alternating current. The fair drew over 27 million visitors over 6 months. For millions of those visitors, many of whom had never seen electric light at all, the experience of walking through an entire city glowing with clean, steady electric light was transformative. It wasn't a technical argument. It was an emotional one. The public saw the future, and the future was beautiful, and it was unmistakably alternating current. 2 years later, Tesla and Westinghouse won the even more important contract, saw it, to build the first large-scale hydroelectric power plant at Niagara Falls. The plant began operation in 1896, sending alternating current to the city of Buffalo, over 20 miles away. With manageable losses, it was the proof of concept for everything that would come after. The basic architecture: generate alternating current, step it up for transmission, send it over distance, step it down for distribution, was established at Niagara Falls. And in its fundamental logic, that architecture has persisted for 130 years. Let that sit with you for a moment. The system design underlying the grid that is keeping your refrigerator cold and your phone charged right now, as you lie here in the dark, was proven in the 1890s. The turbines are larger now. The voltages are higher. The control systems are digital instead of mechanical. But the underlying principle, generate AC, transform up, transmit, transform down, deliver, is Tesla's vision, essentially unchanged, running beneath everything you depend on. And this is precisely where the story begins to get quietly uncomfortable. Because a system whose fundamental architecture was designed in the 19th century expanded haphazardly over 130 years by thousands of different entities with different priorities and different budgets, patched and retrofitted and extended to serve a world its creators could never have imagined, is a system carrying its entire history in its bones. Every wartime shortcut, every budget compromise during a recession, every decision that made sense in 1947 or 1973 but is quietly dangerous in the modern era. It's all baked into the infrastructure, buried in the concrete, and copper, and steel. And some of those accumulated decisions, those layers of historical sediment, are the precise reason the grid fails when it fails. But before we get to the failures, and we will get there in uncomfortable detail, there's one more thing you need to understand about the grid. Something fundamental to how it operates every second of every day. Something that most people find genuinely surprising when they first learned it. And it has to do with rhythm. Right now, at this very moment, every power outlet in your home is pulsing with electricity that alternates direction exactly 60 times per second. That frequency, 60 hertz, is not a random number. It's not something an engineer picked because it seemed like a nice round figure. It is the heartbeat of the entire grid, and every generator connected to the system must match it precisely. If that heartbeat falters, if it speeds up or slows down by even a fraction, the consequences propagate through the entire interconnected system at nearly the speed of light. Here's a way to think about it that makes it tangible. Imagine the power grid as a vast orchestra, thousands of musicians, strong, all playing the same note at the same tempo, 60 beats per second, endlessly, without rest, without intermission. Every generator on the grid is a musician in this orchestra, and every single one of them has to be precisely in time with every other one. If one generator speeds up slightly, its electrical output falls out of phase with the rest of the system. That mismatch creates oscillating forces, electrical and mechanical stresses that can damage equipment, trip protective relays, and potentially disconnect that generator from the grid entirely. If it slows down, the same dynamics play out in reverse. And if enough generators fall out of sync at the same time, the orchestra doesn't just sound bad. It collapses entirely. The coordination that holds the whole system together dissolves, and the lights go out. This matters because the grid's frequency is directly tied to the balance between generation and consumption. This is one of those facts that sounds simple but has enormous and cascading implications. When more electricity is being consumed across the grid than is being generated, the generators experience increased resistance. They're being dragged down by the load like a cyclist hitting a steep hill, and they slow down. The frequency drops below 60 hertz. When more electricity is being generated than consumed, the generators meet less resistance. They speed up, and the frequency rises above 60. In a well-functioning grid, the frequency is maintained within an astonishingly tight band, typically within a few hundredths of a hertz of the 60 hertz target. Think about what that means. Across an entire continent, across thousands of generators, and hundreds of millions of individual consumers, whose collective demand is changing every single second as people turn lights on and off, start and stop machines, plug in and unplug devices. The frequency is held steady to within a fraction of a percent. It's one of the most impressive feats of real-time coordination in all of engineering. And it happens every second of every day, invisibly, without most people having any idea it's going on. There are people whose entire professional lives are dedicated to watching that frequency. In the United States, regional organizations called independent system operators and regional transmission organizations monitor the grid continuously. Their control rooms are enormous, filled with screens showing real-time power flows across thousands of miles of transmission lines. Operators sit before these displays, watching numbers that represent the frequency, the voltages, the power flows, the way an ICU nurse watches the vital signs of a critically ill patient. Because, in a very real sense, that's exactly what they're doing. They are watching the vital signs of a machine that an entire civilization depends on for its survival. And here's something that makes this even more remarkable and a little bit frightening. The grid doesn't just have to balance supply and demand in real time. It has to anticipate demand changes before they happen, because electricity travels at close to the speed of light, and demand can spike across millions of homes in a matter of seconds. The system must have surplus generation capacity, standing by, warmed up, and ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Consider what happens during a commercial break in a major television broadcast. Millions of people stand up simultaneously. They walk to the kitchen. They open refrigerators. They flip on lights. They press the button on the electric kettle. In the United Kingdom, this phenomenon has a wonderful and perfectly descriptive name. They call it TV pickup, and grid operators in Britain treat the television schedule the way military commanders treat intelligence reports. They study it. They know which programs attract the largest audiences. They know when the commercial breaks fall. They know, from decades of historical data, almost exactly how much additional demand each break will create. And they have fast response, generation capacity, particularly pumped storage hydroelectric plants, standing ready to flood the system with extra power the instant the break begins. There is a famous and almost perfectly illustrative example from 1990. During the FIFA World Cup semi-final between England and West Germany, one of the most watched broadcasts in British television history, grid operators recorded a demand surge of approximately 800 megawatts during the halftime interval. To put that in context, 800 megawatts is roughly the output of 2.5 large nuclear power plants. It materialized in a matter of minutes as millions of British viewers put their electric kettles on almost simultaneously. The grid held, but it held only because operators had anticipated the surge with extraordinary precision and had pumped storage facilities ready to release thousands of megawatts of stored hydroelectric power within seconds of the halftime whistle. Think about the precision required for that. Think about the layers of planning and preparation. You put your kettle on during halftime. You don't give it a second thought. But somewhere in a control room, an engineer spent the morning running calculations, checking weather forecasts, reviewing the TV schedule, coordinating with hydroelectric plant operators, making sure that when 20 million kettles switched on, the grid wouldn't blink. That invisible competence, that quiet expertise applied behind the scenes to problems most people don't even know exist, is what keeps the lights on every single day. But this constant balancing act, this perpetual tightrope walk between generating too much and too little, is precisely the grid's greatest vulnerability. The system is engineered to operate within a narrow corridor of stability. A razor-thin margin separates normal operation from disaster. And when something pushes the system outside that corridor, whether it's a tree that falls on a critical transmission line, a relay that fails in a substation, a heat wave that drives air conditioning demand beyond anything the system was designed for, or something far more deliberate like a cyberattack, the response can be catastrophic. Not because any individual failure is necessarily dramatic on its own, but because of how failures interact with each other in a tightly coupled, interdependent system. When one component of the grid fails, its job doesn't just disappear. Its burden gets shifted onto the remaining components. The neighboring transmission lines now have to carry more power. The nearby generators have to work harder. And those neighbors, now carrying more than they were designed for, are stressed, which makes them more likely to fail themselves. And if they do fail all, their burden shifts to the next ring of neighbors. And so on, each failure making the next one more likely, each cascading step happening in seconds or fractions of seconds, spreading outward through the system at a speed that no human operator can match. That's a cascading failure. And it is the mechanism behind virtually every major blackout in modern history. It's the falling dominoes. Except the dominoes are carrying enough voltage to arc through the air, and they're connected to hospitals, water systems, traffic networks, and the homes of millions of people. We're going to go deep into the anatomy of cascading failures, step by terrifying step, and look at exactly how they've played out in real events. But those stories are coming. They deserve their full space. For now, let's sit with one more fact, because it ties everything together, and it's the one that genuinely keeps power engineers awake at night. The grid was not designed as one coherent system. Nobody sat down with a blank sheet of paper and engineered the power grid. The way you'd engineer a bridge or an aircraft or a spacecraft. There was no grand architect. no unified plan. It grew organically, politically, economically, over more than a century. Different utility companies in different states and provinces, operating under different regulatory frameworks with different financial incentives and different risk tolerances, built their own local systems over decades. And then, gradually, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes under regulatory pressure, connected those systems together. In the United States, the result is 3 major interconnections. The Eastern Interconnection covers everything from the Atlantic seaboard to roughly the Rocky Mountains, from the Canadian border south to the Gulf of Mexico. The Western Interconnection spans the Pacific coast, the mountain states, and parts of Western Canada and Mexico. And then there's Texas. Texas operates its own grid. It's managed by an organization called the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, and it is deliberately, intentionally separated from the other 2 interconnections. The historical reason for this is that by keeping the grid entirely within state borders and avoiding connections to the interstate system, Texas positioned itself outside the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It was a political choice made decades ago, rooted in a Texan tradition of independence and a philosophical preference for deregulation over federal oversight. And that choice, which was made by people who could not possibly have foreseen the challenges of the 21st century, had consequences that became terrifyingly clear in February of 2021. But that story, the story of what happens when an independent grid faces a crisis it wasn't built for and can't call for help, deserves its own full telling. We'll get there. The Eastern Interconnection alone is a staggering feat of coordination. It is, by some measures, the largest synchronized machine on the face of the earth. Every generator connected to that network, from a massive nuclear plant in Ontario to a small natural gas turbine in Florida, from a wind farm in Iowa to a coal plant in West Virginia, is spinning at a speed that produced exactly 60 hertz of alternating current, locked in phase with every other generator across that entire vast territory. The synchronization is maintained not by a central command authority, not by a single dispatcher giving orders, but by the physics of interconnected rotating machines, and by a layered, overlapping, sometimes contradictory patchwork of regulations, agreements, market structures, and operational protocols that have accumulated over more than 100 years. And it works. It works remarkably, almost miraculously well, given how it was assembled. The average American household experiences somewhere between 1 and 2 significant power interruptions per year. Across the developed world, power grids deliver electricity with reliability rates that typically exceed 99.9%. Those numbers sound impressive, and they genuinely are. The engineering achievement is real. But here's the thing the numbers conceal. 99.9% reliability means approximately 8 hours of outage per year. And those 8 hours do not arrive as gentle, evenly distributed inconveniences. They don't trickle in as a minute here, 5 minutes there. They tend to arrive in a single catastrophic burst all at once, without warning. Because the power grid does not degrade gracefully. It doesn't send you polite notifications that things are getting worse. It doesn't dim the lights slowly, giving you time to prepare. It runs perfectly, and then it collapses. The transition from normal operation to total blackout can take less than a minute. Sometimes it takes seconds. And when the failure affects a large enough portion of the grid, the recovery, the process of bringing everything back online, takes not minutes or hours, but days, sometimes a week or more, because you can't just flip a switch and restart a blacked out grid. The restart process is itself enormously complex, and we'll talk about why there's an expression that power systems engineers use among themselves. They say, the grid is the most complex machine humanity has ever constructed. And it's run every day by the most optimistic people alive, because keeping this system operational requires truly believing, every single morning when you walk into the control room, that thousands of individual things will all go right simultaneously. That no tree will fall on the wrong wire at the wrong time. That no relay will malfunction in the one substation where it matters most. That no software bug will silently disable the alarm system you depend on. That the weather will stay within the envelope the system was designed to handle. And on most days, on the vast majority of days, that optimism is justified. The orchestra plays in tune. The tightrope walker keeps her balance. The invisible machine hums along, and nobody thinks about it. But the days when the optimism is wrong, the days when the tree falls, and the relay fails, and the alarms go silent, and the weather pushes past every design parameter, those are the days that change history. Those are the days when cities go dark and millions of people discover, abruptly and painfully, just how thin the line is between the modern world and something much older and much darker. Those days have come more often than most people realize, and each one tells a story about the hidden fragility of the machine, about the assumptions we've built our civilization on, and about what happens when those assumptions turn out to be wrong. We'll begin pulling those stories apart very soon. The anatomy of a cascading failure, the precise chain of events that turns single-tripped circuit breaker into a continental blackout, affecting tens of millions. The night in 2012, when the largest democracy in the world lost power for 700 million people in what remains the biggest blackout in human history. The bitter February week when Texas froze and discovered that its independent grid could not save it. But for now, just let all of this settle. The machine is running. You can't hear it, but it's there, humming in the background of your life. Somewhere out in the dark, at this very moment, a turbine is spinning at exactly 3,600 revolutions per minute, which produces precisely 60 cycles of alternating current per second. A dispatcher in a climate-controlled room is watching a wall of screens, making quiet adjustments to keep the frequency where it needs to be. A transformer is humming softly on a utility pole outside someone's window, stepping voltage down for the last time before it enters someone's home. And all of it, every generator, every wire, every switch, every relay, every breaker is balanced on a tolerance thinner than a razor's edge, held in place by physics and by engineering and by the quiet, steady competence of people whose names you will never learn. That's the system. That's what stands between you and the dark. And now that you know what it is, how it was born, how it breathes, how it keeps its rhythm, you're ready to understand how it breaks. And how, when it breaks, the breaking doesn't stop. It spreads, but that can wait. For right now, just breathe. Let the hum of the grid be background noise, the way it was always designed to be. Let it hold you up, the way it holds up everything else, silently, invisibly, one perfect cycle at a time. So, we left off with a promise. The machine is running, humming in the dark, holding everything up. And I said that once you understand how it works, you're ready to understand how it breaks. So let's talk about breaking, the word we use for what happens when a power grid collapses is cascade. And it's a good word. It's the right word. Because what happens isn't a single failure. It's a chain, a sequence, each link pulling on the next, and the whole thing moving faster than anyone can stop it. Here's the thing that makes cascading failures so hard to prevent. Every individual step in the chain is a system working correctly. That's the part that surprises people. When a transmission line trips offline during a cascade, it isn't malfunctioning. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. When a generator disconnects from the grid, that's not a fault. That's not a fault. That's a protection system operating precisely as engineered. Every component in the sequence behaves properly according to its own local logic, and the sum of all that correct behavior is a catastrophe. Let me walk you through how it actually unfolds. Because the mechanics matter, and because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Picture a transmission line carrying power across a region. It's rated for a certain amount of current. Below that rating, it's fine. It runs warm. The metal expands slightly. The line sags a little between towers, and everything is within design parameters. Now, suppose a nearby line goes out of service. Maybe a tree grew too tall underneath it. Maybe a piece of equipment failed at a substation. Whatever the cause, that line is gone, and the power it was carrying has to go somewhere. Fit. Electricity doesn't get routed the way data packets get routed on the internet. There's no dispatcher deciding which path each electron takes. Power flows according to the laws of physics, distributing itself across all available paths in inverse proportion to their impedance, which is a technical way of saying it takes the paths of least resistance, all of them, simultaneously, automatically, instantly. So, the moment one line drops out, its load redistributes across the remaining lines in the network. No human decides this. No computer authorizes it. It just happens. In the time it takes electricity to cross a continent, which is a small fraction of a second. Now the remaining lines are carrying more than they were before. Maybe they're still within their ratings. Maybe they're not. Odd. And here's where it gets physically interesting in a way that I find genuinely unsettling. When a conductor carries more current, it heats up. When metal heats up, it expands. When a transmission line expands, it gets longer. And since it's suspended between two towers, the extra length has nowhere to go but down. The line sags. A transmission line under heavy load can sag several feet lower than the same line under light load. And what's underneath transmission lines? Usually, a cleared corridor, a right-of-way that utilities are required to maintain. But maintenance costs money, trees grow constantly, and corridors are hundreds of miles long. So there's almost always somewhere, in any large system, where a tree has grown taller than it should have. The overloaded line sags into the tree. The tree conducts. There's a flash, a fault, and the protective relays do exactly what they're supposed to do. They detect the fault in milliseconds and open the circuit breakers, disconnecting the line to prevent damage. The line is now out of service, and its load, which was already elevated because it had absorbed power from the first failure, redistributes onto the lines that remain. Do you see what just happened? The system got smaller. The same amount of power is now flowing through fewer paths. Each remaining path carries more. Each one heats up more. Each one sags more. And each one is now closer to its own failure threshold than it was a moment ago. This is a positive feedback loop. Each failure makes the next failure more likely, and the loop accelerates. The first line might take 20 minutes to fail. The second might take 4 minutes. The third might take 40 seconds. By the fifth or sixth failure, the sequence is happening faster than a human operator can read the alarms, let alone respond to them. And then something else kicks in. Something even harder to stop. Generators start disconnecting. Remember the orchestra. Every generator on the grid is spinning in synchrony, locked to 60 Hertz. That synchronization depends on the transmission network holding them together electrically. As lines drop out, portions of the network become weakly connected or isolated entirely. Generators in those pockets can no longer stay in step with the rest of the system. They begin to slip out of phase, and when a generator falls out of synchronism, the mechanical forces on its shaft become violent. We're talking about a rotor weighing hundreds of tons, spinning at 30,600 revolutions per minute, suddenly experiencing torque reversals that can twist steel. So, generators have protection systems, too, and those systems do the sensible thing. They disconnect the generator from the grid to save the machine, which is absolutely the correct engineering decision from the perspective of that one generator, and absolutely catastrophic from the perspective of the grid, because now generation has been lost and the supply and demand balance tips further out of alignment, and the frequency drops harder, which stresses the remaining generators, which causes more of them to disconnect. Two cascades are now running at once. Transmission lines failing from overload, and generators dropping offline from instability, each one feeding the other. And at this point, minutes into the event, there is essentially nothing a human being can do. The system is disassembling itself according to rules that every component is following correctly. The final stage is islanding. As the network fragments, it breaks into isolated pockets, electrical islands, each containing some generation and some load. If an island happens to have roughly balanced generation and demand, it might survive. Frequency stabilizes, the lights stay on in that pocket, and it rides out the storm. But most islands are unbalanced. An island with too much load and not enough generation sees its frequency collapse within seconds, and everything in it shuts down. An island with too much generation and not enough load sees frequency spike, and its generators trip on overspeed protection. Either way, the lights go out, and so, in the space of somewhere between 2 and 10 minutes, a region that was functioning perfectly becomes dark, not because anything was broken, because everything worked exactly as designed. Now, let me tell you about the day this actually happened on a scale that nobody had planned for. August 14th, 2003. It was a hot afternoon in the American Midwest, Ohio, in mid-August. Humid, the kind of heat that makes air conditioners run continuously. Demand was high, but not extraordinary. Nothing about the day looked dangerous. The first thing to understand about what happened that afternoon is that the trouble started small and stayed small for a long time. Small enough that it should have been manageable. What turned a manageable situation into the largest blackout in North American history was not the technical failures. It was the fact that the people responsible for responding to them did not know they were happening. At a control center in Ohio, the software system that monitored the grid and raised alarms when something went wrong stopped working. It didn't crash in an obvious way. It didn't display an error message or freeze the screens. It simply stopped generating new alarms while continuing to look, on the surface, entirely normal. The operators were watching displays that appeared functional. The data on those displays was going stale, but nothing indicated that. Think about how insidious that is. If the screens had gone black, someone would have noticed immediately. If an error had popped up, they'd have called technical support. But a monitoring system that quietly stops monitoring while continuing to look alive is close to the worst possible failure mode, because it doesn't just remove your information. It removes your awareness that your information is gone. The operators had every reason to believe the grid was fine, because the tool whose entire purpose was to tell them otherwise had gone silent without saying so. Meanwhile, out in the field, the physical cascade was beginning. A transmission line contacted a tree that had grown into the corridor beneath it. The line tripped. Its load shifted to neighboring lines. Those lines heated, sagged, and over the following hour, more of them made contact with vegetation and tripped as well. Each failure was reported into a system that was no longer telling anyone about it. Operators at neighboring utilities began calling. They could see that something was wrong from their side. But the people who could have taken corrective action, who could have shed load or rerouted power, or asked generators to adjust output, were working from a picture of the grid that had frozen more than an hour earlier. By the time the situation became undeniable, the window for intervention had closed. The cascade proper began in the late afternoon, and it moved with a speed that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Within roughly 7 minutes, the failure propagated across Ohio, into Michigan, north into Ontario, east through New York, and into parts of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont. Over 250 power plants disconnected. Transmission lines tripped across an area covering thousands of square miles. Roughly 55 million people lost electricity. 55 million. That's more people than live in most countries on Earth, plunged into darkness in less time than it takes to make a cup of tea. And what happened next is the part that stays with me, because it reveals how many other systems are quietly leaning on the grid without anyone thinking about it. In New York City, the subway stopped. Trains that were between stations stayed between stations, in tunnels, in the dark, in August heat, and passengers had to be walked out along the tracks by transit workers with flashlights. In office towers, elevators stopped between floors, and firefighters spent the evening going building to building, prying doors open. Water systems in several cities lost pressure because the pumps that maintain it are electric, and residents were told to boil water. They couldn't boil because their stoves were electric too. Cell networks stayed up for a while on battery backup, then began failing as the batteries drained. Gas stations couldn't dispense fuel Airports halted operations. Border crossings backed up. Refineries in the affected region shut down, which affected fuel supplies for days afterward. And here is a detail that I think about a lot. Many hospitals ran on backup generators, which is exactly what backup generators are for. But backup generators are typically sized and fueled for a few hours of operation on the assumption that a serious outage will be resolved within that window. When the outage stretched past that window, hospitals had to arrange emergency fuel deliveries through cities with no traffic lights, no functioning gas stations, and roads jammed with people trying to get home. Some facilities came close to running out. The blackout also produced something unexpected and rather beautiful. In the largest cities in the eastern United States, with the light pollution suddenly switched off, people went up to their roofs and saw stars. Many of them had lived their whole lives in those cities and had never seen the night sky properly. There are accounts of strangers standing together on rooftops looking up. Neighbors who had never spoken cooked food on grills before it spoiled and shared it in the street. Crime rates in most affected areas did not spike the way people feared. Mostly, people helped each other and waited. Restoration took roughly 2 days for most customers, and longer in some places. And the reason it took that long brings us to something most people have never heard of, which is genuinely one of the most fascinating problems in all of engineering. Restarting a power grid from nothing. Here's the problem. To start a large power plant, you need electricity. A coal or nuclear plant requires enormous amounts of power just to begin operating. Pumps to circulate water, fans to move air, control systems, lubrication systems, motors to turn the turbine slowly until steam can take over. All of that runs on electricity, and normally that electricity comes from the grid. But in a total blackout, there is no grid. So you have a genuine chicken and egg problem. You need power to make power. The solution is called black start, and it depends on a small number of specially designated facilities that can begin generating without any external electricity. Usually, these are hydroelectric dams because water flowing downhill needs no help getting started, or gas turbines with dedicated on-site diesel generators large enough to spin them up. So the sequence goes like this. A black start unit comes online. It energizes a section of transmission line, a path deliberately planned in advance to reach a larger plant. That larger plant uses the incoming power to start its own systems, and once it's running, it adds its capacity to the tiny island. Now island is bigger and can support starting the next plant. And you repeat this, expanding outward, plant by plant, region by region. The tricky part is that at every step, you have to keep supply and demand balanced within that growing island. Add too much load too fast, and frequency collapses and you're back to zero. Add generation without load, and frequency runs high. So, Restoration teams bring customers back in carefully sized blocks, matching new demand to new generation, watching the frequency the entire time. And there's a subtlety that makes it harder. When power returns to a neighborhood after hours of outage, the initial demand is much higher than normal. Every refrigerator and freezer restarts. Simultaneously, every air conditioner in every home kicks on at once, all trying to cool spaces that have been warming for hours. Electric motors draw several times their running current at startup. So, the load that comes back is a spike, not a steady figure. And operators have to plan for that spike, or it will knock the island back down. This is why restoration takes days rather than hours. It isn't slowness or disorganization. It's the careful, methodical reassembly of a continental machine, one balanced piece at a time. The 2003 blackout led to real changes. Reliability standards that had been voluntary became mandatory and enforceable. Vegetation management around transmission corridors became a legal requirement with penalties attached. Monitoring and alarm systems were reviewed and hardened. Coordination between neighboring operators improved, so the lesson was learned, sort of. Because the deeper lesson, the one about tightly coupled system, failing in ways nobody predicted, is not the kind of lesson you learn once and then stop having to worry about. 9 years later, on a much larger scale, it happened again. In late July of 2012, India experienced 2 consecutive days of grid collapse that together constitute the largest power outage in human history by number of people affected. On the second day, roughly 700 million people lost electricity. That is close to 1/10 of everyone alive on Earth at the time. The circumstances were different from Ohio in important ways. India's grid was under enormous structural strain. A weak monsoon season meant hydroelectric output was down, while agricultural demand for irrigation pumping was up. Exactly the wrong combination. Several states were drawing more power from the interconnected system than their allocations permitted, a chronic problem that was widely known and inconsistently enforced. The margin between what the system could deliver and what was being demanded had narrowed to almost nothing. And in a system with no margin, a single disturbance has nowhere to be absorbed. When a key transmission link tripped, the power that had been flowing through it redistributed onto neighboring corridors that had no spare capacity. Those corridors tripped. Regional grids that had been synchronized separated from each other. Frequency in the deficit regions collapsed, and protective systems shut everything down. The human scale of that event is hard to hold in your head. Hundreds of trains stopped, stranding passengers across the country. Miners were trapped underground when hoist systems lost power. Hospitals fell back on generators. Traffic in major cities became gridlocked without signals. Water supply failed in many areas because, again, pumps are electric. But here's a nuance that I think is important. And it's easy to miss if you only look at the headline number. The impact per person was in some ways less severe than a comparable outage in a wealthier country would have been, because a large portion of the affected population had limited or intermittent grid access to begin with. Rural households accustomed to daily scheduled outages were less disrupted than urban ones, which is a genuinely uncomfortable observation, because what it really tells you is that the deeper your dependence on the grid, the more devastating its absence. Reliability creates dependence, and dependence creates fragility. Think about that for a second. The more successfully we build these systems, the more completely we organize our lives around them, and the further we have to fall when they stop. And a society that expects power 99.9% of the time builds hospitals, water systems, food supply chains, and communication networks that assume continuous electricity. A society that expects power 60% of the time builds differently, keeps alternatives, maintains habits and equipment for going without. Our reliability is real, and it is also the thing that makes our vulnerability so acute. Which brings us to February of 2021 and to Texas, and to a failure that was less about physics and more about choices. I mentioned earlier that Texas operates its own grid, deliberately isolated from the rest of the country to remain outside federal jurisdiction. For most of its history, that arrangement worked fine. Texas has abundant generation and its own market structures, and it kept the lights on. Then a severe winter storm pushed Arctic air deep into the southern United States, and temperatures across Texas fell far below anything the system had been prepared for. Two things happened simultaneously, and their combination was lethal. Demand surged because millions of Texas homes are heated by electric resistance heating and heat pumps rather than natural gas furnaces. When temperatures plunge, electric heating demand rises steeply. Heat pumps in particular lose efficiency in extreme cold and switch to backup resistance heating, which draws far more power. So, demand went vertical, and at the same time, supply collapsed. Natural gas wellheads froze at the source, cutting fuel supply to gas plants. Water in instrumentation lines at power plants froze, taking units offline. Wind turbines without cold weather packages iced up. A nuclear unit tripped because a sensor line froze. Coal piles froze into solid masses. Almost every category of generation failed, and they failed for the same underlying reason. Equipment that could have been winterized had not been, because winterizing costs money and severe cold in Texas is infrequent, and it had happened before. A comparable, smaller, cold weather event a decade earlier had produced investigations and recommendations to winterize generation and gas infrastructure. Those recommendations were largely voluntary, and they were largely not implemented. The economics didn't favor it. In a competitive energy market where generators are compensated for the power they sell, spending capital to protect against a rare weather event that may not occur for years is difficult to justify to shareholders. So, it wasn't done. As supply fell and demand rose, grid frequency began to drop. Operators shed load, cutting power to customers deliberately, which is the emergency measure of last resort, but is vastly preferable to the alternative. And the alternative was very close. By multiple accounts, the Texas grid came within a small number of minutes of a complete, uncontrolled collapse. Had that happened, the black start process would have taken not days, but potentially weeks in freezing temperatures across a state of 30 million people. The controlled outages, brutal as they were, prevented something far worse, but brutal they were. Millions of homes lost power for days in temperatures that made unheated houses genuinely dangerous. Water systems failed and pipes burst throughout the state. More than 200 deaths were attributed to the event, from hypothermia, from carbon monoxide poisoning, as people burned charcoal and ran generators indoors trying to stay warm. From medical equipment losing power, from delayed emergency care. And because Texas was isolated, it could not import meaningful amounts of power from neighboring grids. The interconnections to the rest of the country exist but are small, limited to a few direct current ties with modest capacity. Connected fully to the eastern interconnection could have drawn on generation across a dozen other states. Texas could not. The independence that had been the point of the arrangement became the constraint that deepened the disaster. I want to be careful here, because it's easy to turn this into a simple story with a simple villain, and it isn't one. Full interconnection has costs too, including exposure to cascading failures originating elsewhere. Air. Winterization is genuinely expensive. Market designs that reward reserve capacity have their own inefficiencies. Reasonable people disagree about the right trade-offs, but what is not really disputable is that a set of decisions made over years, each defensible in isolation, produced a system that could not survive a weather event that had been specifically warned about a decade earlier. That's the pattern, isn't it? It keeps recurring. In Ohio, an alarm system nobody knew had failed. In India, margins that everyone knew were too thin. In Texas, winterization that everyone had been told to do. None of these were mysteries. In every case, the vulnerability was documented before the disaster. The failure wasn't in knowing. It was in acting on what was known when the cost was immediate, and the benefit was hypothetical. And humans, collectively, are not good at that. We are not built to spend money today to prevent something that might happen in 11 years. Every institution we've created struggles with this. And power grids, which require enormous long-term capital investment to prevent rare catastrophic events sit right in the center of that blind spot. Let's talk about age, because it's part of the same problem. A large fraction of the transmission infrastructure in the developed world was built during a period of rapid expansion in the middle of the 20th century. Major transformers, transmission towers, transit towers, substation equipment. Much of it was designed with a service life of several decades, and much of it has been in service longer than that. Large power transformers deserve particular attention here because they represent a vulnerability that very few people are aware of. These are the enormous units, substations, that step voltage between transmission and distribution levels. They are custom built for specific applications. They weigh hundreds of tons. They cost millions of dollars. And critically, the manufacturing capacity for them is limited and concentrated, with lead times that can stretch to a year or more, even in normal conditions. Utilities keep some spares, and there are industry sharing programs. But the inventory is thin relative to the installed base. In a scenario where many large transformers failed simultaneously, whether from a coordinated physical attack, a severe geomagnetic event, or simply a bad run of age-related failures, replacement could take a very long time. This is a known concern in grid security circles, and it's the sort of problem that is easy to describe and expensive to fix. Which brings me to the sun. Our star is not a steady, quiet neighbor. It's a churning ball of plasma with a magnetic field that periodically reorganizes itself violently. And when it does, it can eject billions of tons of magnetized particles into space at enormous speed. When one of those ejections is aimed at Earth, it interacts with our magnetic field, and that interaction induces electrical currents in long conductors on the surface. Pipelines, railway signaling, and transmission lines. The currents induced this way are direct current, slowly varying, and power grids are not designed for direct current. Transformers, in particular, respond badly. The induced current saturates the transformer core, causing it to heat and to draw reactive power in ways that destabilize voltage across the system. Severe enough, and transformers can be damaged permanently. This is not hypothetical. In March of 1989, a geomagnetic storm caused the collapse of the electrical grid serving Quebec. The entire province lost power in under 2 minutes in winter, affecting millions of people. Equipment damage occurred as far away as New Jersey. The storm that caused it was significant, but not extreme by historical standards. And that qualifier matters because we have records of a much larger event. In September of 1859, an extraordinarily powerful geomagnetic storm struck the Earth. It's known as the Carrington event, after the British astronomer who observed the solar flare that preceded it. Aurora were visible near the equator. The only electrical infrastructure that existed at the time was the telegraph network, and it was badly affected. Operators reported shocks, sparks from equipment, and lines that continued to carry signals after being disconnected from their batteries because the storm itself was energizing them. In 1859, the consequence was a disrupted telegraph system. If the same event occurred today, it would induce currents in a global network of high-voltage transmission lines, and the transformers connected to them. Estimates of the impact vary widely and depend heavily on assumptions, but these serious analyses agree that widespread transformer damage and long-duration outages across large regions are plausible outcomes. In July of 2012, a coronal mass ejection of comparable magnitude to the Carrington event crossed Earth's orbital path. It missed us. Earth had been at that location roughly a week earlier. It was observed by a solar monitoring spacecraft, so we know what it was, and we know how close the timing was. There are mitigations. Operators can be warned because these events travel slower than light, and we have satellites watching the sun giving somewhere between 15 minutes and a day or so of notice depending on the event. With warning, grids can be reconfigured, transformers taken offline, load reduced. Blocking devices can be installed on transformer neutrals to prevent induced current from entering. This work is being done in some places. It is not finished anywhere. So, we have an aging system built on a 19th century architecture, carrying loads its designers never imagined, exposed to a natural hazard we can predict but not prevent, defended by equipment we cannot quickly replace. And on top of all of that, we're now asking the grid to do something it was never designed for at all. We're asking it to change because everything safe we've discussed so far assumed a particular kind of generation. Large plants spinning heavy turbines, producing steady, controllable output, located where the utility chose to put them. That's the grid Tesla designed for, and the grid that grew through the 20th century. The generation mix is now shifting toward wind and solar, and those resources behave completely differently. Solar output depends on the sun and drops to zero every night. Wind output depends on the weather and can swing substantially over hours. Neither one can be dispatched on command the way a gas turbine can, and neither one, in its basic form, provides something that conventional plants provide almost incidentally. That something is inertia, and it's one of the most elegant and underappreciated features of the old system. A conventional generator has a rotor with enormous mass spinning at high speed. That spinning mass stores kinetic energy. When something disturbs the grid, when a large load switches on, or a generator trips offline, that stored kinetic energy responds automatically and instantly. The rotors slow slightly, releasing energy into the system, and that slows the rate at which frequency falls. It buys time. Seconds, sometimes only fractions of a second, but enough time for control systems and reserve generation to respond. Nobody engineered inertia deliberately. It's simply a physical consequence of using heavy spinning machines to make electricity. It came free with the technology, and the entire protective architecture of the grid, all the relay settings and response times, was designed around the assumption that it would be there. Solar panels have no rotating mass at all. Wind turbines rotate, but they're connected through power electronics that decouple them from grid frequency. So as these resources displace conventional generation, system inertia declines, and frequency responds faster to disturbances. Events that a high inertia system would have absorbed without difficulty can push a low inertia system toward its limits. This is a solvable problem. Batteries can respond in milliseconds faster than any mechanical system and can be programmed to provide synthetic inertia. Grid forming inverters can make renewable resources behave more like conventional generators from the system's point of view. Synchronous condensers. Spinning machines, essentially large spinning machines that provide inertia without generating power, can be installed. The engineering exists, but it has to be deployed at scale at the same time as the generation transition itself, and the transition is moving faster than the supporting infrastructure in many places. So there's a window, and we're inside it now, where the old assumptions are becoming less true and the new solutions aren't fully in place. There's a second challenge, which is geography. The best wind resources and the best solar resources are frequently far from where people live. Transmission has to be built to connect them. And building new transmission is one of the slowest things our societies do. A major line can take a decade or more from proposal to energization, most of it consumed by permitting, environmental review, land acquisition, and litigation. Nobody wants transmission towers across their property or their view. So, we have a system that needs to be substantially rebuilt on a timeline set by climate policy and market economics, using a permitting process designed for a different era while continuing to deliver reliable power every second of the transition. You cannot take the grid offline for renovation. It's like being asked to replace the foundation of a house while the family keeps living in it. And I want to be clear because it would be easy to hear all of this as an argument against the transition. It isn't. The engineering challenges of a renewable grid are real, and they are also tractable. Systems around the world are already operating at very high renewable penetration and maintaining reliability. It's being done, but it's being done through deliberate investment in the supporting infrastructure. And where that investment lags, reliability suffers. The technology isn't the bottleneck. The planning, the permitting, and the willingness to spend money on things that prevent prevent problems rather than create visible benefits. That's the bottleneck, which is exactly the same bottleneck we saw in Ohio, in India, and in Texas. It keeps being the same problem, wearing different clothes. So let's take stock of where we are. We have a machine of continental scale, architected in the 19th century, assembled piecemeal over 13 decades by thousands of independent entities. It has no meaningful storage, so it must balance production and consumption in real time, continuously, forever. Its components are tightly coupled, so failures propagate rather than staying local, and they propagate faster than humans can respond. Much of its physical infrastructure is past its design life, and its most critical components have replacement times measured in months or years. It's exposed to a solar hazard that has demonstrated its ability to collapse regional grids and could plausibly do far worse. And it is currently undergoing the most fundamental transformation in its history, changing the physical nature of its generation while remaining in continuous operation. And it works. That's the strange part. Every one of those statements is true, and the lights are still on. Right now, as you're lying there, the frequency is sitting within a few hundredths of a hertz of where it should be, and it will still be there when you wake up. That's not luck. It's the accumulated result of a great deal of careful engineering and a great many people paying close attention to things that no one thanks them for. But it does mean something worth sitting with as you drift off. The reliability you experience is not a property of the universe. It isn't the natural order of things. It's choice that gets made and remade and paid for every single day by people and institutions you will never see. And when those choices get deferred, when the maintenance gets postponed and the winterization gets skipped and the alarm system doesn't get checked, the fragility doesn't announce itself. It waits. It accumulates, invisibly, for years, and then it arrives all at once on an ordinary afternoon in August or an ordinary week in February. We still have more ground to cover: the security dimension, the deliberate attacks, and the digital vulnerabilities. The question of what a genuinely long blackout would mean and how societies have handled the ones they've had. And the more hopeful part, the technologies and approaches that could make the next century's grid more resilient than this one. But not tonight. Not right now. For now, the machine is still running. Somewhere, a turbine is turning at exactly the right speed. Somewhere, an operator is watching a number that hasn't moved. Somewhere, a transformer is humming on a pole, doing the same simple job it has done every night for 30 years. Let it hum. Let the frequency hold. Let all of it stay balanced out there in the dark while you rest, the way it has held every night of your life, quietly, invisibly, without ever asking you to notice. So far, everything we've talked about has been accidental. Trees that grew too tall, alarms that went quiet, weather that arrived colder than anyone planned for. Failures that happen because complicated systems eventually find the seams in their own design. But there's another category, and it's the one that grid operators think about most carefully, even though it has caused the fewest outages so far, because some failures aren't accidents at all. Some of them are somebody's intention. Let's start with the physical side, because it's simpler and in some ways more sobering. Substations are not fortresses. Drive out past the edge of almost any town, and you'll find one. A fenced rectangle of gravel, a chain link perimeter, some warning signs, and inside it, the equipment that steps voltage down for an entire region. Transformers the size of small buildings, circuit breakers, control cabinets, usually no guard, often no one on site at all, monitored remotely, visited occasionally, otherwise left alone. That's not negligence. There are tens of thousands of substations in a country, the size of the United States, and staffing everyone around the clock would be economically impossible. The security model has always been that they're numerous, distributed, and individually not that important. Lose one, and the network routes around it. But that model has a weak point, and it's the same weak point we've been circling all night. The components inside those fences are not interchangeable. Large power transformers are custom built, enormously heavy, and take a long time to manufacture. A substation that loses its transformers isn't back in a week. It might be back in a year. In April of 2013, someone demonstrated an understanding of this. At a substation in California, attackers first cut fiber optic cables in an underground vault, disrupting communications. Then, from outside the fence, they opened fire on the substation with rifles. They didn't target the fence or the control house. They targeted the transformers. And specifically the cooling systems, firing into the radiators so that oil drained out and the units overheated. 17 transformers were damaged. The attack lasted under 20 minutes. Whoever did it left before police arrived, and the case was never solved. Grid operators managed to reroute power and avoid an outage, which is a real testament to how much redundancy the system has. But the event changed how the industry thought about physical security because it wasn't vandalism. Whoever planned it knew what a transformer radiator was, knew that draining the coolant would destroy the unit without needing to breach the fence, and knew to cut the communications first. That's not opportunism. That's reconnaissance. Since then, there have been other incidents, including attacks on substations in North Carolina in December of 2022 that left tens of thousands of customers without power for days. The pattern that concerns security researchers isn't the individual and security events, which have been limited in scope. It's that the knowledge required is not secret, the targets are not hardened, and the replacement components are not on a shelf somewhere. The industry response has included better fencing, ballistic barriers at critical sites, improved camera coverage, and expanded spare transformer sharing programs between utilities. It helps. It doesn't eliminate the underlying asymmetry, which is that defending thousands of remote sites is expensive, and attacking one is not. There's a related vulnerability that almost nobody outside the industry is aware of, and it has to do with time. Modern grid protection and monitoring depends on extremely precise timing. When you're measuring the phase angle of alternating current at 2 points, hundreds of miles apart, and comparing them, you need those measurements timestamped to within microseconds, or the comparison is meaningless. And the source of that timing, almost universally, is satellite navigation signals. Those signals arrive at the surface of the Earth extraordinarily weak. They can be disrupted by jamming with modest equipment, or spoofed, meaning a receiver can be fed false signals that shift its idea of what time it is. A protection system operating on a corrupted clock may make incorrect decisions about whether a fault has occurred and where. The industry knows this. Newer equipment includes holdover oscillators that maintain accurate time for a period after satellite signals are lost, and there's ongoing work on terrestrial timing backups. But it's a good illustration of a recurring theme, which is that modernization tends to introduce dependencies that the older, cruder system didn't have. Every improvement in capability tends to come with a new thing that can be taken away from you. Now let's talk about the digital side, which is a different kind of problem entirely. For most of its history, the grid was not really connected to anything. Control systems were physically separate from business networks. Protocols were obscure and proprietary. Many devices predated the internet entirely and had no capacity to be reached from outside. Security came from isolation, from the simple fact that there was no path in. That isolation is largely gone. Over the past few decades, utilities have connected their operational system to corporate networks for good reasons, including remote monitoring, faster fault diagnosis, better efficiency, and the coordination that a modern electricity market requires. Every one of those connections is valuable. Every one of them is also a path. And here's what makes industrial control systems genuinely difficult to secure. The equipment life cycle is measured in decades. A relay installed in 2005 is a young relay. Some devices, still in service, were installed when the primary security concern, concerns, was whether someone might physically walk into the building. You cannot patch them the way you patch a laptop, because many of them cannot be patched at all, and because taking them offline to update them means taking part of the grid offline. So, you end up defending decades-old equipment designed with no security model, using perimeter controls and network segmentation and monitoring. It's a legitimate approach, and it's the only practical one. But it means the security posture depends on those perimeter defenses holding, rather than on the underlying devices being resistant to attack. The world got a clear demonstration of what this means. In December of 2015, in Ukraine, attackers had spent months inside the networks of several regional electricity distribution companies. They got in through targeted phishing emails, carrying malicious documents, then moved patiently through the corporate networks, harvesting credentials, mapping the environment, and eventually finding their way into the operational systems that controlled substation equipment at. Then, on a December afternoon, they acted, using legitimate remote access tools and legitimate operator credentials. They opened circuit breakers at dozens of substations. From the system's point of view, nothing improper was happening. The commands came from authorized accounts, using authorized accounts, authorized software. The breakers did exactly what they were told. Roughly 230,000 people lost power, but the part that made analysts pay real attention wasn't the outage. It was everything else the attackers did to slow the recovery. They overwrote firmware on communication devices so that operators lost remote control and couldn't simply close the breakers back. They wiped hard drives on control workstations. They disabled backup power in some control centers, so the people responding to the blackout were themselves working in the dark. And they flooded utility call centers with automated calls so that customers couldn't report outages, and operators couldn't get an accurate picture of what was down. Power was restored within hours, but only because Ukrainian utilities still had manual capability. Crews drove to substations and physically closed the breakers by hand. The old-fashioned analog fallback, the thing that a fully modernized grid might have eliminated as redundant, is what ended the outage. A year later, in December of 2016, it happened again in Kyiv. And the second attack was more sophisticated in a way that should be understood clearly. The first attack used human operators clicking through remote sessions in real time. The second used purpose-built malware that understood industrial control protocols natively and could issue commands on its own. That's a meaningful change. The first approach requires skilled people working live, one substation at a time. The second is a tool. Tools can be copied, modified, and reused. Tools scale. Since then, other capabilities have been identified in the wild, including malware designed to interfere with safety instrumented systems. The last line of automated protection at industrial facilities. Those systems exist to shut a process down safely when something goes wrong. Malware that targets them isn't trying to cause an outage. It's trying to remove the safety net. I want to be careful about proportion here because it would be easy to leave you with the impression that the grid is about to be switched off by someone at a keyboard. That is not the state of things. Attacks of this kind are hard. They require long-term access, detailed knowledge of specific target facilities, and significant resources. The capability is largely confined to well-funded state programs. And the deterrence considerations are real because critical infrastructure attacks against a nation are widely understood as escalatory in a way that most cyber activity is not. There's also a supply chain dimension that has drawn attention in recent years. Grid equipment is manufactured globally, and the components inside a transformer or a control system come from a wide range of suppliers, verifying that complex hardware contains nothing it shouldn't is genuinely difficult, and the concern is less about a dramatic hidden switch than about the practical impossibility of fully auditing in a system this large. Several countries have moved to restrict foreign sourcing of critical grid components, which addresses part of the problem and creates cost and availability problems of its own. More importantly, defenders have been working on this for years. Grid cybersecurity standards are mandatory and audited. Monitoring for operational networks has matured enormously. Information sharing between utilities and government has improved. Many utilities now run exercises, specifically rehearsing loss of control systems, and manual operating procedures are being deliberately preserved rather than retired. That last point deserves emphasis because it runs against the general direction of technological progress. The lesson from Ukraine was partly that the ability to operate the grid without computers is a security asset. Utilities that maintain trained crews who can drive to a substation and throw a switch have a recovery path that no attacker can code around. It's slow and it's expensive to maintain, and it turns out to matter. So, the honest picture is this. The threat is real. It's been demonstrated, it's improving, and it is being taken seriously by people who are competent. It's a serious, ongoing security problem rather than an imminent catastrophe. Those are different things, and it's worth holding the distinction. But it does raise a question that's worth sitting with, and it's one that emergency planners have thought about more than the rest of us. What would actually happen if the power stayed off for a long time? Not hours, not 2 days, weeks. We have very little direct experience with this at scale in a developed economy, which is itself telling. Most of what we know comes from partial events and from modeling. The first day is inconvenient. You've likely lived some version of it. No lights, no internet, food in the refrigerator that needs eating. Phones work until they don't. It's disruptive and mostly survivable. The first week is where it changes character, and it changes character, and it changes because of water. Water systems depend on electric pumps at nearly every stage, drawing from source, treatment, and maintaining pressure in distribution mains. Many facilities have backup generators typically fueled for a few days. When those run out, pressure falls. When pressure falls, contamination can enter the mains through leaks that pressure was previously keeping out, and the boil water advisory that follows assumes you have a way to boil water. Wastewater is the same problem in reverse. Sewage moves partly by gravity, but requires lift stations to get over terrain, and those are electric too. When lift stations fail, sewage backs up. In dense areas, that becomes a public health emergency quickly. Fuel is the second constraint, and it's the one that makes everything else worse. Gas station pumps are electric. Refineries need power. Pipelines are moved by electric pumps. So, the generators, hospitals and water plants and communication sites depend on are running on a fuel supply that itself depends on electricity. Every backup system in the chain assumes the outage is short enough that refueling remains possible. In a long outage, that assumption breaks, and it breaks for everyone simultaneously. Food distribution runs on refrigeration and trucking, both of which fail without power and fuel. Grocery invent in modern cities turn over in days because just-in-time logistics made warehousing unnecessary. Payment systems stop working, cash becomes necessary, and ATMs don't dispense it. Communications degrade in stages. Cell sites have batteries lasting hours, and some have generators lasting days. As they fail, coverage becomes patchy and then absent. The ability to coordinate a response depends on the ability to communicate. So, this failure compounds every other one. Medical needs continue regardless. Dialysis requires power and treated water. Oxygen concentrators require power. Insulin requires refrigeration. Hospitals on generators can function for a while, but they cannot function indefinitely, and the patients who depend on equipment at home have no generators at all. Temperature is the constraint that determines how much time you actually have. A long outage in mild weather is a hardship. The same outage in extreme heat or deep cold becomes a mortality event because buildings are no longer designed to be habitable without mechanical conditioning. Modern construction is sealed and insulated on the assumption that air will be actively moved and conditioned. A well-insulated house without power holds its temperature longer than an old drafty one, which helps in cold and hurts in heat. But neither is designed to be occupied for a week without any climate control at all. And the populations most affected are entirely predictable. The elderly, who regulate temperature poorly and are more likely to live alone. People dependent on powered medical equipment. Those in high-rise buildings where water pressure and elevators both fail. Anyone without the means to relocate. In essentially every heat and cold event on record, the mortality falls disproportionately on the same groups, which means the outcome of a long blackout is less a question of engineering than of whether anyone knows where those people are and goes to find them. None of this is speculative. Every element of it has been observed in real events, in hurricanes and ice storms, and the outages we've already discussed. What we haven't observed is all of it at once, over a wide area, for an extended period. And I want to say something about how people behave in these situations, because the cultural expectation and the evidence do not match. The popular assumption is that a long blackout means rapid social breakdown. That's not what the research on disasters generally finds. Now, what tends to actually happen is that ordinary people organize themselves quickly and effectively. They check on neighbors, particularly the elderly. They pool food before it spoils. They share generators and fuel. They direct traffic at broken intersections. Improvised local coordination emerges fast and works surprisingly well. In 2003, across a blackout affecting 55 million people, this is essentially what occurred. Crime did not spike in most areas. People walked home across bridges in enormous orderly crowds. Restaurants cooked and gave away food. Strangers offered rides and floors, space, to people stranded far from home. That's the pattern researchers find repeatedly. Where things go badly wrong, the failure is usually institutional rather than social. It's when official response is slow, or resources don't reach the people who need them, or vulnerable populations were already isolated before the event. The danger in a long blackout is much less about people turning on each other and much more about the elderly woman on the 9th floor, whose elevator doesn't work and whose neighbors don't know she's there, which is oddly reassuring and also points at where the actual work is. Resilience is substantially a function of whether communities know each other before the lights go out. There's one more thing worth saying about long outages, and it concerns knowledge rather than equipment. A century ago, most households had non-electric fallbacks as a matter of course. Wood or coal heat, oil lamps, wells with hand pumps, root cellars, and preserved food. Not because anyone was preparing for disaster, but because that's simply how things were done, and the electric versions arrived as additions rather than replacements. Those fallbacks are almost entirely gone now, and so is the practical knowledge of using them. That isn't a moral failing or a sign of softness. It's the natural result of a system so reliable that maintaining alternatives stopped making sense. Nobody keeps an oil lamp because the lights have worked every night of their life. But it does mean that the skills and equipment that would make a long outage survivable have quietly disappeared from ordinary households over about 3 generations, and they disappeared precisely because the grid succeeded. That's the same trade we saw in the India comparison. Reliability produces dependence, dependence hence erodes alternatives, and the erosion of alternatives raises the cost of the failure that reliability made unlikely. It isn't an argument against reliability. It's just the shape of the bargain, and it's worth seeing clearly. So let's turn to what's being built. Because the picture isn't only about vulnerability, start with storage, because it addresses the constraint we've kept returning to all night. The grid couldn't store electricity, so it had to balance instantaneously, and that requirement is the root of most of its fragility. That's changing, and faster than most forecasts predicted. Grid scale. Battery installations have grown enormously over the past centuries as lithium-ion costs fell dramatically. These are large facilities, containers of battery modules connected to substations, and they do several things at once. They absorb excess generation and release it later, smoothing the mismatch between solar output at midday and demand in the evening. They provide reserve capacity for sudden imbalances. And critically, they respond in milliseconds, far faster than any thermal plant, which makes them excellent at stabilizing frequency. Batteries are still measured in hours of output rather than days, and seasonal storage remains unsolved, but the trajectory matters. Every increment of storage relaxes the instantaneous balance requirement slightly, and that requirement is where the fragility lives. Other approaches are being developed for longer duration. Pumped hydro, which we discussed earlier, remains the largest form of grid storage in the world and is limited mainly by geography. Compressed air storage in underground caverns. Thermal storage in molten salt or heated rock. Flow batteries, using liquid electrolytes in tanks, where capacity scales with tank size rather than cell count. Hydrogen produced by electrolysis, when power is abundant, stored, and converted back later at low efficiency, but potentially over months. Each has a different cost and efficiency profile, and it's genuinely unclear which will dominate. Then there's a structural change that I find more interesting than any single technology, which is the move from a centralized architecture toward a distributed one. The traditional grid is a one-way system. Big plants at the top, power flowing down through transmission and distribution to passive consumers at the bottom. That's Tesla's architecture, and it held for over a century. What's emerging is different. Rooftop solar means houses generate. Home batteries mean houses store. Electric vehicles are batteries on wheels that could feed power back when needed. Smart devices can shift their consumption in response to conditions. The consumer at the bottom of the hierarchy is becoming a participant. This changes the engineering substantially. Distribution networks were designed for power flowing one direction and are now handling reverse flows on sunny afternoons. Protection schemes assumed faults would be fed from upstream only. Voltage regulation assumed a predictable gradient. Utilities are working through all of this, but it also creates a resilience opportunity that the old architecture couldn't offer, which is the microgrid. A microgrid is a section of the network with its own generation and storage that can disconnect from the main grid and continue operating independently. A hospital campus, a university, a military base, a neighborhood. During normal conditions, it operates connected, buying and selling power like anything else. When the surrounding grid fails, it islands deliberately and keeps its own lights on. This is a fundamentally different model of reliability. Rather than trying to make one enormous machine perfect, you accept that large systems occasionally fail, and you make sure critical pieces can survive independently when they do. It's the difference between a single unbreakable chain and many smaller chains, where a break in one doesn't propagate to the rest. Microgrids have been deployed at hospitals, campuses, industrial facilities, and at community scale in places with poor grid reliability or high exposure to storms. The economics have been the barrier, historically, because you're duplicating capability that the main grid already provides. As battery and solar costs fall, and as the cost of outages becomes better understood, that calculation has been shifting. There's another idea in this space that I think is underrated, which is treating demand as something adjustable rather than fixed. For the entire history of the grid, demand has been the independent variable. People use what they use whenever they want, and generation chases it. That was the deal. But a growing fraction of demand doesn't actually care exactly when it happens. An electric car plugged in overnight needs to be charged by morning, not immediately. A water heater needs to have hot water available, not to heat at any particular minute. A commercial building's cooling can drift a degree or two for a while without anyone noticing. If those flexible loads can shift by even a modest amount in response to grid conditions, the effect is equivalent to adding generation, and it costs far less. This is called demand response, and utilities have run versions of it for decades with large industrial customers who agree to reduce consumption during peak periods in exchange for lower rates. What's new is extending it to millions of small devices through automation so that it happens continuously and invisibly rather than through phone calls to factory managers. Electric vehicles are the most interesting case because a car battery is very large compared to a house's daily consumption. A parking lot full of connected vehicles is a substantial energy resource. Charging can be shifted to whenever supply is abundant, and in principle, vehicles can discharge back to the grid during peaks, though that raises questions about battery wear and about whether people will accept their car being used this way. The technical capability exists and is being piloted. Whether the incentives and the consumer acceptance follow is a different question. There's also substantial work happening on the control side. Grid operators are deploying sensors that measure voltage and current phase angle many times per second across wide areas, giving a real-time picture of system stress that simply didn't exist during earlier blackouts. Automated systems can detect developing instability and act within cycles faster than any person could. Machine learning is being applied to predict equipment failures before they occur, so transformers can be replaced during planned maintenance rather than at 3 in the morning during a heat wave. That last point connects back to something I keep coming back to. Most of what makes the grid more reliable isn't dramatic. It's vegetation management. It's replacing equipment before it fails. It's checking that the alarm system is actually working. It's winterizing plants for a cold snap that might not come for a decade. It's unglamorous. It's expensive. It produces no visible benefit when it works, and it is the entire difference between a system that holds and a system that doesn't, which brings me to where I want to end. I've spent this whole time telling you about fragility, the instantaneous balance with no margin, the cascades that outrun human response, the aging transformers we can't quickly replace, the sun that occasionally throws things at us, the attackers who've demonstrated they can get in, the transition we're attempting while the machine keeps running. All of that is accurate. And I want to put something next to it that's equally accurate. The grid works. Right now, tonight, as you're lying there, it is working. The frequency is sitting within a few hundredths of a hertz of where it should be. Millions of components are doing their jobs. It will still be working when you wake up, and the overwhelming likelihood is that it will still be working every morning for the rest of your life. That's not an accident, and it's not luck. So, it's the most successful piece of infrastructure engineering our species has ever managed. We built a machine spanning a continent, running continuously for over a century, coordinated across thousands of independent organizations with no central commander, delivering something that cannot be stored to hundreds of millions of people who never think about it. It has failed spectacularly a handful of times in 130 years. Measured against the difficulty of the problem, that's remarkable, and every one of those failures taught us something. The Ohio blackout produced enforceable reliability standards where there had been suggestions. The solar storm over Quebec produced a serious program of geomagnetic monitoring and protection. Ukraine taught the world that manual operating capability is a security asset worth preserving. Texas produced winterization requirements that had been recommended and ignored for a decade. We are slow, and we usually need to be hurt before we act, but we do act. I think the honest way to hold all of this is that the grid is neither as robust as it feels nor as fragile as it sounds. It's a machine of extraordinary reliability, sitting on top of assumptions that mostly hold, maintained by people who are mostly diligent, funded at a level that's mostly adequate. Most is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and closing the gap between mostly and reliably is the work of the next few decades. What I find genuinely moving about all of this, and I do find it moving, is how much of it depends on care, not brilliance. Care, someone trimming trees along a corridor in a county you've never heard of. Someone checking that an alarm system generated an alarm today. Someone in a control room at 4 in the morning watching a number that hasn't changed. And staying awake anyway, because the one night they don't is the night it matters. None of those people will ever be famous. Most of them will go their entire careers without anyone outside their industry knowing what they do. And the measure of their success is that you have never once had to think about them. That's the deal we've made. An enormous, invisible machine tended by invisible people, holding up a world that takes it entirely for granted. And the taking for granted isn't ingratitude. It's the point. It's what the whole thing was built to allow. A civilization where you don't have to think about where light comes from is a civilization that can think about other things. So, as you lie here in the dark, know that it's out there. The generators are turning. The lines are carrying their load. The frequency is holding at 60. Somewhere a dispatcher is watching a screen and everything. And if on it is normal, which is the best thing a screen in a control room can be, you don't have to think about any of it. That's what all of it is for. Let the numbers hold. Let the machine hum. Let it do what it has done every night of your life, quietly, invisibly, without ever asking you to notice. So slight, well,